Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. Today in another prize news, but a slightly different one, I'm going to be talking about the BookTube Prize. And so, as the name suggests, it's not a sort of literary prize over here, kind of in a sort of official thing, you know, like with a sponsor and all that kind of jazz. Instead, this is very much chosen by people on BookTube, on Bookstagram, various other reviewers, and just people who really want to take part as well. All set up by Robert Sheard, and I'll tag the channel as well below. But essentially, the BookTube Prize starts off with many books and slowly whittles it down round on round. And each round you're given basically 6 books from one of 3 categories, either non-fiction, fiction, or translated fiction, and you basically read all 6, choose your top 6 and rank them, and then from there they kind of get collated, and bit by bit we knock books out until we get down to the final bit. And here we are now at the final stage, and I've mostly been doing, well, I did a bit of translated fiction, and I did a round of general fiction, as well as in sort of fiction written originally in English. But this has been such an interesting one to judge, and I'm glad that 2 of the ones that I had in one of my earlier categories are in these final ones as well. So here's me talking about the 6 books in the final of the BookTube Prize. So let's go. So first up, going by the authors' names, we have Selva Almada with Brickmakers, translated from the Spanish by Annie McDermott, published in the UK by Charco Press. And this basically focuses on a set of characters and the violence that can kind of come up because of where you are and the things around you. So in this book, we're focused a lot on this idea of machismo, and particularly the men in this book trying to really be more masculine than each other and really kind of show each other out and up to kind of hide things. But actually, once sexuality comes into the mix with this book becomes very different, and is really intriguing for how it explores it. And so we look a lot at actually what does it look like when in a machismo culture, or, you know, with sort of men who are really obsessed with not showing any weakness, when the idea that one of them might be gay comes into the mix, we start to see how that violence gets amped up even further, because men are sort of trying to hide who they are, and actually how ultimately this leads to some really quite horrific consequences. It's not an easy book to read, and for the first bit of this book I was a bit confused about where it was going, and I was a bit worried as well. But I think actually I then really got into it and just thought, like, how stunning is this book? Just for the way that it really starts to build into this pace of talking about what's going on here. I just thought this book did some really interesting things, and was one of kind of hit about middle of the pack, or sort of higher end of the middle for me, in this set of 6. I just think it's a really interesting book, and Charco Press are also just very exciting for the books they publish. Next up, we have How to Order the Universe by María José Ferrada, who is a Chilean writer, and it was translated from the Spanish by Elizabeth Bryer. And this is quite a short book, and also I had a real issue tracking it down, so eventually had to read it in German through Scribd, which may account for some of my kind of confusion about bits of it. I had to sort of read a bit of a plot summary first, then read it in German, and then hope that I kind of slotted it together. But a large part of what this book does is tell a story from a young child's perspective, and particularly this sort of, I mean, I'm a bit of a sucker for it, of sort of reading a book through a child's eyes and watching as the landscape changes in quite a ferocious and terrifying way. And the relationship between daughter and father here is quite interesting, for how the daughter is constantly trying to make everything right and kind of trying to understand everything that's going on around her, while everything falls apart, while we've got kind of dictatorships, and while we've got these many other big things coming up in the world. Meanwhile, she's sort of, you know, making sure that she's sort of focused on things like shoes, and like doing the little kind of correct things that will get everything along the way. And there's some really beautiful passages in this about around the mother, and about like how you look after each other, how you sort of aim to kind of save yourself or save others when given the chance. It's quite, some of my confusion of this will again be that I read it in German, and therefore probably missed some of the other nuances of this book. But I think it seems to be quite clever just in terms of how it blends the politics of everything going on with this sort of innocence of a child trying to work out quite what's going on and almost falling into this sort of fantastical world while she's trying to do so. Next up, we have The Anomaly by Hervé Le Tellier. And this book ended up being a really big bestseller, and is such an interesting book for so many reasons. So in the book, we basically introduced to a set of characters, and then quite early on we find out that essentially what's happened is, in the middle of a hailstorm, this plane seems to have essentially duplicated. There's this sort of brief window of time where it is duplicated, and so all of these people suddenly have a second version of themselves out in the world. The problem being as well that these planes land, I think, is 106 days apart. So there's one plane that lands in March, another plane that lands in June. And so what has happened between March and June often can be a really interesting thing for these characters. So in one of them, one of the characters has died. And so actually the June version suddenly appears and everyone's a bit confused about what's going on here. In another one, you know, somebody was about to play a concert, and then in June they're kind of waking up, you know, they're getting off this plane being like, right, I'm going to go and perform, but actually the concert's already happened like 3 months ago. And all of these various other things happen in the book, to the point where then we get towards the end of the book and the Secret Service and sort of FBI and various other agencies are really invested in trying to work out what's happening and to stop this becoming more of a thing. They're really nervous about this being an attack by the Russians, or, you know, something like that. They've been experimenting with time travel, and that's what's made this all happen. And I just think it's such a clever book for how it kind of feels at first like you're reading a sort of more sci-fi genre kind of fiction thing, which, you know, not bad in itself, but then really keeps on making you guess. It keeps on changing what it is. It keeps on growing to a new form, and so it's just a very clever book. Also feels quite weirdly self-referential by accident, in the sense that there's a lot of reference in this book about these book prizes of an author at the beginning who has written a book called The Anomaly, and he talks about, you know, the Prix Goncourt, like one of the biggest French book prizes, which The Anomaly itself then won. So there's this really weird parallel as well, which actually oddly fits in the lore of this book in terms of a duplication. We also just get, you know, then what it looks like when you try and when you get out the other side. If you meet your twin, or this kind of duplicated version of yourself with slightly different memories of the last 3 months, what do you do? And in some, they kind of come together, but then there are these sort of religious groups who see it as the coming of the end of the earth, and so they start protesting this and causing violence. It's a lot going on in this book, and I just thought it was a really clever and fun and engaging read as well. There's also Disquiet by Zülfü Livaneli, a Turkish writer, and this book is translated by Brendan Freely, and it's just such an interesting book, basically focusing on a Yazidi woman from Syria, particularly once the Syrian conflict hits, what that then means for this sort of displacement of people. You know, there are 3 million people who moved to Turkey from mostly from Syria, but from some other neighboring countries as well. And what that means for people creating a brand new world. In the meantime as well, we also have talk of other displacement. So Turkish people in Germany, where there's a sort of a fairly large Turkish population. And there is somebody at one point who is killed in Germany who is Turkish. And so we kind of get this sort of almost camera moving back to Turkey to kind of really think about what's going on. And so when people are a bit angry about this Yazidi woman moving in, people kind of say, well, actually, look, like, there are quite a few Turkish people who moved to Germany. Like, actually, who are we to say this? But actually, at the heart of it, I just found it such a beautifully written and thoughtful book. It's really poignant in so many ways about how it talks about the loss that comes with having to move to a new place, and sort of watching, you know, leaving your home behind, not knowing if you're ever really going to be able to go back, and also some of the parallels, right? There's a sort of religious fanatics who will be quite anti some of the people coming to Turkey, but also neo-Nazis attacking Turkish people in Germany. And so this sort of, these weird parallels that kind of come through, and I found it a really unsettling book. I read it all in one sitting. It's quite a short book, but found it incredibly lyrical and thoughtful in how it approaches these. Next, we have The Phone Booth at the End of the World by Laura Imai Messina, translated by Lucy Rand. And this book is a really sort of lovely look at grief and loss, but particularly in the midst of sort of the aftermath of the tsunami that hit Japan in 2011. And so we see the sort of how communities try to come back together after this. How, you know, if you don't know where people have gone, what do you do? Like, you know, people are missing and there's no real closure. You just have to assume that they're dead. And how do you manage that grief? How do you manage that loss? And there is a telephone booth that is found, hence the title of this book. And this is then a phone booth that people then use to talk to their loved ones and sort of come to terms with everything that's hit them. So they sort of speak into this phone and sort of imagine basically that they're talking to their lost ones, their loved ones. And people then begin to travel to this. It becomes a bit of a thing. And I just thought this was such a delicately done book in so many ways, a really clever book, at just how many different ways there are to process grief. People do these things, they come together to try and do this and talk to each other and support themselves, but actually ultimately they don't always know how to cope, and that's okay. And in the midst of that, we come across all these different ways of people talking to family members and trying to understand what it means to be part of a family when you've just lost somebody huge in your life as well. So a really interesting book, and I can see why it made it to this final bit. I did occasionally find it a little bit meandering, but I think that's actually part of the appeal of it, that it's sort of it sort of is quite open to telling lots of little stories and kind of having them just get discussed quite beautifully in this book. And in some ways, a natural sort of a book that sits along quite nicely with Disquiet. We have The Art of Losing by Alice Zeniter, or Zeniter, translated by Frank Wynne, who was also one of the judges for this year's International Booker Prize. And this book is quite a long one. It's about 500 pages, but really, I think, does a lot with those 500 pages. For me, this was just such a stunning book, so incredibly lyrical. This was my favourite from the list, actually. And I think essentially what it looks at a lot is sort of generations of movement and of migration and of war and so many other things, and what effect those things have on the next generation, and how sometimes there are things that can almost feel like curses that are passed down from generation to generation. But actually, there are also some small changes that one person would have made, or big changes that have massive knock-on effects later on. So if your family moves to a different country, you are then born in that country later, you grow up in an entirely different world in many ways to the ones that they were born in. And so this creates these sort of different things down the line. And we talk about, in this book, we sort of have quite a lot around Algeria. And so Algeria as a former French colony, and what it then means if this sort of family has moved to France and this other person grows up as a sort of person of a former, you know, with origins of a formerly colonized nation, who doesn't really spend any time in that nation and now feels quite removed from it. You know, if they visit, it's kind of quite strange. They don't really have that same connection to it. But actually, at the same time, there's this sort of, there are these other knock-on effects that go on down the line. You know, do you consider yourself French because of where you're born, or because of blood, or because of whatever else? And so many things kind of get passed on through this book. And I just think it's stunning. It's so lyrical. I was really dreading it when it first came for the first prize, the first round where I read this, because it's 500 pages, and there was another 500-page book that I read for that as well. And I thought this was just such a gorgeous, gorgeous book. Really cleverly done, beautifully translated, I think. I mean, I don't know the original, but it's an incredibly well-written book in English. So, you know, hats off to Frank Wynne there as well. I think this is a stunning book. It talks so much about colonization, about kind of history, and the knock-on effects that it has on generations, even sort of things like generational trauma and how that passes on. I just think this is brilliant. And so those are all of the final 6 books in this prize. And probably by the time this video goes out, we will know the winner. But for me, my personal winner, as you probably could tell by my gushing over it, is Alice Zeniter's book, The Art of Losing, which I just think is such a stunning book. I'd probably say Disquiet or The Anomaly are probably some close runner-ups for me as well. I think The Phone Booth at the Edge of the World as well, great book. How to Order the Universe, I just thought had so many poignant moments as well. And Brickmakers, I just think does something really quite clever with a conversation about masculinity. So all really good, interesting books, but that's sort of where I am on this as well. So yeah, I hope if you've been following along and been reading the BookTube Prize yourself, that you've been really enjoying it, whether you've sort of just been watching it, whether you've been taking part, anything like that. But really highly recommend you sort of keeping an eye out for it and potentially taking part next year. I found it really fun to open me up to brand new books that I hadn't read before. In the fiction category, I'd read quite a fair few of them before, but the non-fiction category, the translated fiction category is where I knew none of these books pretty much, and it's been a really great experience for me as well. I've been Bod the Booker, talking about the BookTube Prize. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.